Welcome viewers. Today's session we will have an analysis of the poem 1915 by Robert Graves. Robert Graves is a well-known American poet, novelist and lecturer. Graves was ridiculed at school for his relative poverty. Partly to get away from his life, Graves left his studies at Oxford and was enlisted for the First World War in 1914. He had several near-death experiences in the war that left him shell-shocked, and he lived with the fear of gas attacks for the rest of his life. Graves completed his studies at Oxford after the war. Graves was one of the first poets to write realistic war poetry that spoke about life in front-line conflict. His first collection of poems, Over the Brazier, was published in 1916. Graves, along with other poets such as Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, were instrumental in initiating a genre of war poetry that sprung up suddenly in the First World War period. Apart from war poetry, Graves in his later life also wrote love poetry. However, Graves was not just a poet. He was a versatile author and wrote novels, short stories, biographies, and even translated some texts. Graves published a collection of short stories called Catacroak, mostly stories, mostly funny. His Lawrence and the Arabs is an acclaimed biography of the renowned British Army officer T.E. Lawrence. Graves was able to give a personal touch to the understanding of this charismatic personality, as they were friends during their days in Oxford University. Graves' autobiography, Goodbye to All, clearly details his experiences in war and the difficulties of adjusting to life after war. In his autobiography, Graves refers to war and all that is associated with it. The frank nature of the book led to many critics banning the book, but the book went on to become a bestseller. Graves was also an acclaimed translator and translated several classical Latin and ancient Greek texts into English. He also translated Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat in collaboration with Oman Ali Shah in 1967. He published many interpretations of classical poetry such as Greek myths. He wrote many historical novels such as I, Claudius, in which he constructs a compelling story around the Greek Emperor Claudius. He wrote a sequel to it entitled Claudius the God. His other historical novels are King Jesus, The Golden Fleece, and Count Belisarius. His works are popular to this day due to Graves' entertaining style. Graves was not just a popular novelist, but also a critically successful author, and notable among his awards is the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, which he won in 1934. Graves was honored as the last surviving war poet in 1985, the year he passed away. The poem Under Purview 1915 is part of the war poetry that he wrote while participating in World War I. It speaks about the uselessness of war that makes men miss out on simple but important things in life. The poem also points out that men become less human after they have witnessed a war, which, according to him, is full of meaningless bloodshed. Robert Graves was 20 years old when the First World War took place. He wanted a means of escape from the taunts of his friends and decided to enlist in the First World War in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in August 1914. He grew up in the belief that England was always right and so sought to prove this through his service in the war. But his hopes of escape and service came to naught. He was disillusioned by war. As early as 1914, he told his friend that he could not imagine why he had joined the war. He felt bad that he was violating his own anti-war principles. But enlisting in the war was also the only thing that youth were supposed to do during the war, irrespective of their principles. In a sense, he had no choice. Graves never found what he was looking for in enlisting for war service. Rather, he found terror and madness. Graves fought valiantly in the trenches of Northern Europe. He was severely injured at one time in the war and even assumed to be dead. He also suffered from guilt as he got away from fighting due to injury while other soldiers had to carry on fighting. He was shocked at the mass killings in the war. He could not understand the killing of so many people when peace was such a desirable and beautiful option. Graves was deeply affected by the war, not just for the period when he physically fought in the war, but for the rest of his life. He took the aid of poetry to overcome the nightmares, hallucinations, and tortured memories of death in the war. Graves believed that a poet is one who uses all the resources of language and his own talent to articulate man's overcoming of the cruel realities of one's historical period. Not just Graves, but many other soldiers of the First World War wrote poetry to express their feelings of the war. Notable among them are Rupert Brooke, Julian Grenfell, Francis Lewis, Wilfred Owen, Isaiah Rosenberg, Charles Sorey, Edward Thomas, Ivor Gurney, Edmund Blunden, David Jones, and Siegfried Sassoon. While some of these poets died fighting in the war, some others became mentally unstable for the rest of their lives. The present poem is an attempt to deal with the harsh happenings of war. 1915 was published as part of the poetry collection Over the Brazier in 1916. Through the poem, the poet wonders why there should be war at all when peace offers the better rewards. Graves suggests that the simple rewards that peace offers to the individual has to be accepted with open hands rather than plunge into meaningless war. The poem is not just about war in general, but also has particular references to the First World War where Graves fought. Le Bessay and Bethune, which are mentioned in the second line of the poem, refer to the infamous Battle of Ypres, also called the Massacre of Innocents of Ypres. There was heavy loss of life on both English and German sides. The First World War thus forms the direct background to the poem. The poem is addressed to a loved one, most probably Graves' wife. The addressee is someone who is not fighting in the war and who is waiting for Graves' return. The poem is not a recollection of the events of the war written in a later period of peace, but a piece of writing during the war waiting for action. Patiently waiting in the trenches, the poet says he has watched the seasons change. The reader can glean from this that he has been in the war for not just a month or 2 months, but at least a year, as he has been through the change of seasons. The trenches that the poet is sitting in are fields located between Le Bessay and Bethune. Le Bessay and Bethune, these two place names have special significance in the context of the First World War, especially for Britain. They were the places where the infamous Ypres battle happened. Many soldiers were killed on both sides. The trenches where the men waited in anticipation of a bloody war were full of wounded and scared soldiers. The manner in which Graves describes the seasons is characteristic of his mood. Spring is traditionally characterized by primroses. Spring is the first season that the poet encountered in the war. So, he still thinks of spring romantically, looking at the primroses in the fields around him and experiencing the spirit of spring renewal. The first day of spring is warm and pleasant, and the poet likes the feeling. June is the month when the crop of poppy harvests. But by then the poet has seen the reality of war and bloodshed. This makes him describe poppy not as pleasant or good, but as red poppy floods. One cannot help but feel that the poet is referring to the floods of blood when he speaks of the crops of poppy. The poet is now unable to appreciate the beauty of nature, but relates it to the gory happenings that he has to be a part of. The next season that the poet lives through is autumn in the month of August. Autumn depresses the poet as he can only see around him not lush green but yellowed leaves on branches. Yellow is generally used to refer to decay, degeneration and slime. The poet can also see decay of not just bodies but also human values. His hopes for mankind are also yellowing or fading, along with the yellow leaves and falling into dust and disuse like the falling leaves. Winter with its snow does not make the poet happy either. He cannot think of the scene as picturesque as he had done with spring. He cannot marvel at the white cover that nature had wrapped all around. The army's marches mean that the poet has to wade through the snow and mud in the cold. This is image of very young men walking desolately with snow biting their feet and mud making their feet dirty in the pitch dark that winter brings, feeling frozen all over, and yet having to march as those are the orders. In all those woeful seasons of war, the poet thinks of his beloved. In the next stanza, Graves speaks about the things that he misses the most when he is out fighting in a war. He terms the trenches where he is posted as soul deadening. By this, he is referring to the effect that war has on the soldiers fighting the war. The soldiers are sitting in the trenches, waiting to kill and to be killed, witnessing so much bloodshed that normally one would not see even in a lifetime. The effect is so horrific that they begin to regard even natural seasons as bloody, as explained in the previous stanza. The soldiers lose all humanity and their souls thanks to the soul deadening trenches. The poet tells his sweetheart that she reminds him of all that he has missed, as she reminds him of all the good things in life. Before the war, when at home, the poet was an art lover, looking at paintings and appreciating them. He read a lot of books too. He enjoyed music. He misses all these activities. He also misses the peace and tranquility offered by the woods of England, where he often had walks to soothe himself. He now lacks the innocent love of his dear one, the simple pleasure derived from stealing glances of one's beloved cannot be compared to anything in the world. He also misses the narrow mountain roads full of boulders which he used to frequent. He also liked to sit near the ocean and enjoy the effect of the majestic sea with its hues of green and black had on him. All these things are possible only in the time of peace. They also indicate an intellectual and aesthetic leaning on the part of the poet. Books, pictures, music, innocent love are all products of culture and of civilization. The poet seems to suggest, therefore, that war is a place where culture and civilization are absent. The difference between leisure and boredom is also spelled out here. The activities mentioned in this stanza are those that the English country gentleman takes part in as part of his leisure time. It cannot be considered as work but relaxation. Although there is a lot of free time in wars as well, It cannot be termed leisure, but ennui and tedium. There is always anticipation of the army, but otherwise there is not much to do except observe the seasons. The poet thus dispels the common notion that wars are places of adventure and excitement. The poem is also an elegy on the loss of a way of life. Before the First World War, the upper class hardly had to work. The upper class gentleman would settle in the countryside where he would hunt and go for walks. The ladies painted and played music and sang melodies. It was possible to enjoy the beauty of nature by participating in such activities. One's aesthetic sense was also heightened by these. The First World War put an end to all this as this kind of world came to an end. People moved to cities and looked for jobs, and even women moved away from cozy huts to hard work. Of course, all this is led to a more democratic world and, in a sense, liberation. But it did not necessarily mean that people liked it, and they were nostalgic for the lost feudal past. Also, after the experiences of the war, it was not possible to look at life in a simple manner like one could do earlier. The poet equals peace and goodness. He believes that the best of human nature comes out in peacetime, while the worst in wartime. The poem is thus a condemnation of war and the effect it has on soldiers. It also glorifies the simple pleasures in unadulterated, simple but cultured homes which are untouched by war. The poem 1915 is a short one of only 14 lines, but it conveys what it wants to in this short length. The language is simple, not consisting of difficult words or allusions that are hard to figure out. The first stanza of the poem about the wartime experiences of the soldiers naturally moves on to the second stanza about the peacetime pleasures experienced by the poet. The 14 lines of the poem make it a sonnet, but it has no definite rhyme scheme. Only a few words rhyme, such as spring everything, sow snow, books comrade looks, and track black, and it is not possible to think of it in terms of rhyme. There are a number of images that are put forward in the poem. Some of the images are primroses, warm days, poppy, yellowing autumn, English woods, ocean, etc. We have already spoken about how primroses signify hope and red poppy floods signify bloodshed. But these are not the only interpretations. Graves used loaded terms in this poem, which suggests altogether different interpretations. For instance, the expression treading the primrose path, being indulgent, given to pleasures, what it means. Also, poppy being the crop of opium, which can be taken as a drug, can be interpreted to mean indulgent. These two expressions taken together make for an interesting explanation. The soldiers spend days of loneliness with only strangers around them. They also experience a lot of pain when they are injured. These two factors make them seek oblivion in some form or the other. This might lead to them consuming drugs to ease the pain of loneliness as well as physical pain. This indulgence is what Graves means by primroses and poppy. He suggests that such indulgence is not good and would not be necessary in peacetime, where the mind is calm. No harmful means of oblivion are needed in such a time. Legacy and Bethune are symbols of the war, motifs that most Britons can relate to, as they were part of infamous Viper's War, where thousands of Britons lost their lives. The very mention of these place names, even as geographical indicators, brings to the mind images of violence. Consciously inserting these names thus is a ploy of Graves to make the reader recall the horrors of war in the second line of the poem. The way Graves has used the seasons is in tune with the general mood of the poem. Unlike most poets who write odes to the different seasons, Graves uses them to understand the situation of the soldiers at war. All the seasons mean hardship and loneliness to them. His use of words is masterful. For instance, the phrase yellowing autumn obviously refers to the yellow leaves that are a characteristic of autumn, but it also refers to the decaying state of mind that the soldiers have reached. They also indicate the slowly fading hopes of humanity. All the images invoked by the poet in the second stanza, books, pictures, woods, music, etc., bring to mind a calm and peaceful existence with the pleasures of conversation and love. These are the sights and scenes of a simple, civilized home. This is effective in making a contrast between life at war and life in the time of peace. Thus, the imagery in the poem 1915 helps in conveying the message of the poet in a pithy yet convincing manner. It is significant to study the present poem for various reasons. The poem 1915 might have been written at a particular period, speaking about a particular war, that is, the First World War. But the poem is by no means dated. It can be used to speak about any war at any point of time. The relevance of the poem is the contemporary scenario that can be understood in this context. The two great world wars might have been over, but there have been several wars after that all over the world. The Vietnam War, the India-China, India-Pakistan wars, the Afghanistan War are only a few examples. Several soldiers have lost their lives in these wars, while others have had terrible experiences, forcing them to modify their understanding of the world and its wars. It is important to remember these things, as war is an unwanted but unmistakable reality in this so-called civilized world. Before thinking of war, people who rule countries would benefit by reading poems like these and mulling over them. The futility of war and the hardships of soldiers, as shown in the poem, might change the minds of the politicians, and we might yet have a peaceful world. I hope all the viewers have enjoyed this session of the poem named 1915. We have seen the effects of wars and what people would be missing when they are in front. Thank you.